Hello crafty friends, I'm Lynn from Studio Kato and I'm so glad you're joining me again today. Today's card is a fun scene card, but it steps it up a little bit in a really easy way. So let's get right into it. I'm starting out with the lined paper stamp by Brutus Monroe. This is a photopolymer stamp as far as I can tell. A lot of Brutus Monroe stamps aren't, but this one is, so it stamps nicely. And I'm stamping that in a gray ink. This is Dove by Concord the 9th. And I'm just stamping that once on one side, and I will turn my page over as well to stamp it on the other side, because that side will also show. I am stamping it on a piece of paper that's slightly larger. This is Clairefontaine DCP 250 GSM cardstock, and I like to take a piece of cardstock that is larger than my background stamps because I don't like stamping right up in the edges of my Misti because it stamps a little bit off sometimes. Now once that's stamped on both sides, I will distress the paper, which is a fancy way of saying I will ruin it. I am going to crumple this up, pinch it in a couple of places to get some nice creases, and then I will cut a hole in the middle and rip some edges open as well. This is nice thick cardstock, so it will hold its crumpled shape nicely, especially if you use some foam tape to adhere it, which I will do. Now I thought the pieces that I pulled open were a little bit too long, so I'm just trimming those off. I am not being particular about this because it's not supposed to look really nice or anything like that. I did reference the stamp set off to the side there, the images that I will be using for my scene, to make sure my hole in the paper would be nice and large enough. And I'm taking a scrap of watercolor cardstock. This is Canson Montval 200 GSM, and I'm stamping a bunch of the images from the set on there. And then I will take a piece of cardstock, also watercolor cardstock, that will fit nicely behind my ripped paper. I even lined the opening of the ripped paper on there with a pencil, just so I had an idea of the space I had to fill. And I'll take some more stamps of the We Beelong stamp set by My Favorite Things to stamp those out and create a nice scene. I did just use an acrylic block for that because I find it a lot faster if you have to stamp the same image a couple of times, but I did do it inside of my Misti because the foam inside of the Misti really helps with stamping. Now to color these images, I'm using watercolor. Maybe the watercolor cardstock I stamped them on gave it away already, but I really like the soft tones I can get with watercolor. Now I am working in layers. That darker paint I am putting on now is the second layer, which means that before I put that on, I made sure that anything I put down before was already dry. I am not going wet on wet here. I like to get a little bit more control over my paint, and that's easier to do when you let everything dry in between before you put on another layer. I'm going to do quite a few layers for this bear because I started really light and I do want some nice shading on there. Now the way I build up colors is I mix my lightest shade first. A lot of people do it the other way around because that's probably the best way to do it, but I am so used to this now that there's no changing my ways anymore. I just mix my lightest shade first, just a little bit of paint with a lot of water, and then I keep adding in more paint as I deem necessary. I am working with two sizes of paintbrushes for this bear. I am trying to get better at using appropriate brush sizes, so that really helped with that large bear head. I will list all the brushes I used in the supply list below. These are really great watercolor brushes, but they are a little bit pricey. Now, the difference in price and quality in paintbrushes is really noticeable in my opinion. These are natural hair brushes. You can find really decent synthetic brushes as well, but I find them usually more pricey than the natural hair ones, so this is what I ended up with. And the difference in quality is mostly noticeable in the shape of the brushes. High quality brushes hold their shape a lot better. So when you're doing a lot of detail work like card makers usually do, you might want to invest in something that will hold its shape over time and will keep a nice fine point. They also hold water better, so you can paint longer with them, which is really nice when you're doing backgrounds. But I, as you probably know by this point, like to work with as little water as possible so I have as much control as possible over where the color goes. And as I said that, I started painting a background that uses a lot of water. So for this background, I like to do my skies in a very particular way. I like to add water first over the entire surface that I will be painting and then drop in some color. I will then blend that out again with more water and then dab some of it away, and this will give a subtle cloud effect. And for the grass and the pond, I am again working in layers. I didn't like the pond because I was trying to paint it realistically, which wouldn't fit the images at all, so I just went over it with a darker shade. Now usually I'd recommend for everything to be dry before you go in with a color right next to it, but when painting this pond I purposely went in with the green of the grass while the pond was still wet, so that would bleed into the pond a little bit, and that gives the idea of reflections or even that the grass or the weeds are still growing inside the pond as well. So sometimes it's really nice when things bleed together, and I really like that option in watercolor as well. Now I just glued that little scene, that watercolor scene, down onto my card base, and then I am adhering that ripped paper. You can absolutely just use lined paper. I had this stamp lying around, and the lines are a little finer, closer together, so I really like that for a card. But you can also just use whatever you have lying around. I'm adhering that on foam tape so it will nicely hold its crumpled shape, and that creates some depth as well. Having your scene just appear through something like this, or just a window, you can die cut a window, that would be really nice as well, is a really fun way to change things up. And when I do that, I always like to stamp some extra images that I also used in the scene. So these flowers, for example, I also stamped some bees, and I will scatter those around the scene, so they seem to be coming out of the frame. I just glued the flowers down directly onto the paper, but for the bees and for the bear, I used some foam tape that I cut into smaller pieces. I also cut out some extra flowers, and I will adhere them right there where I thought the ripped paper didn't look that good. So that's a nice way to cover that up. And that finishes up this card. You can absolutely add a sentiment strip to this as well, but I really like my scene cards to just have a nice message written on the inside. Now for the matching envelope, again, I am going to keep things simple. I always keep my envelopes as simple as possible because I already put a lot of time in that card. I folded an envelope with my We Are Memory Keepers 123 punch board. This is of course an A2 sized envelope because I made an A2 sized card, and I folded that from Clairefontaine DCP 250 GSM cardstock. Now this is a bit thick for an envelope, so I need to look for some thinner cardstock to stamp on. I'm just taking some of the images, the flowers and the bee, and a little bit of grass as well, and stamping that directly in colored ink on my envelope. I inked up the flowers partially with pink, and then I inked up the stems and the grass underneath them with some green, and this is really easy to do if you have some ink cubes. If you only have the large ink pads, I'd suggest you use an ink dauber to apply it to your stamp. So a really quick and easy envelope with a really fun card as well. I really like how this card turned out. I've been wanting to use this lined paper stamp just for this purpose for a really long time now, and I finally got around to it. I did add a couple of details in white gel pen in the pond. I didn't film that. I just realized that when I was taking pictures that would be a nice touch as well. So that's how the card turned out. I hope you like it. If you did, make sure to leave a like on this video and leave your thoughts in the comments below. I would love to read them. Of course, you can always subscribe to my channel if you want to see more of my videos. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.